Thank you, Mr. Deep. Yang Berusaha Dr. Subu, Undersecretary, Climate Change Division, CASA. Also participants from local PBTs, and also I see Nasha from UNDP, and our trainer. Good afternoon. So my name is Yusmazi, and today I will just take you through a few slides where I'll try to explain the low carbon cities in the context of climate change in Malaysia. Okay, next. Okay, if you can see these slides here, this is like an overall policies that we have in Malaysia. So if you look at the middle, top middle, there's a sustainable goal, development goals, sustainable development goals that is guiding our policies basically in Malaysia. So on the left side, we have a green tech policy, national green tech policy, which was developed in 2009, and also the national policy on climate change, which is also was produced in 2009. From these two documents, they gave birth to our GTMP, which is the Green Technology Master Plan, where in this GTMP, we have about 5 sectors that we try to put targets for reduction of emissions. So I think one of it would be the energy, and under the energy would be buildings at local levels and at national levels. So from this GTMP, we also have come up with a low carbon cities framework in 2000. Sorry, can you go back? In 2011 and in 2017. So from this framework, we have developed a Low Carbon Cities Challenge 2030, where local governments are being given capacity building to come up with a baseline, and also to have their initiative, their plans for going towards low carbon cities. And with these two framework, we also, under this Gatal CC project, we have come up with a low carbon city master plan, where it will be an umbrella policy for the development of low carbon cities for at the state levels. Say on the right side of the slides is basically all the physical plans for Malaysia. That also includes state structure plans, and also at the district local plans. So these plans are being, being monitored by Plan Malaysia, and this also supports our initiative towards low carbon cities in the country. So can we move to the next slide? Okay, for your information, this is where the emissions levels according to all the sectors under the IPCC guidelines. As you can see here, under the IPCC, we have 4 major sector where we calculate the emissions for the country. The first one would be the energy, which includes building and also transportation. The next is the industrial process and product use. The third is the agriculture, which includes the land use change, and also forestry. The fourth is, of course, the waste. So these sectors are also the areas being tackled at the local governments. So as you can see, the major emissions are coming from the energy sector, and the rest follows by IPPU, agriculture, and also waste. So, okay, these are the sectors that all our mitigations at national levels are being planned for us to help reduce the country's emission, and at the same time trying to fulfill our commitment for our nationally determined contribution under the UNFCCC. So can we move to the next slide? Okay, these are the time series data that we have collected at the national level from 1990 to 2015, where, as you can see, we have like an increased pattern of emission, especially on the energy sector. And on the bottom one, where we have sinks, our forests, we have managed to to have a sinks basically at a stable level, because our commitment to set our forest cover in Malaysia at 50% rate, forest cover at 50%. So if you can see, prior to 2004, we are basically net mean our sinks absorbs most of our carbon emissions. But from 2005, we are seeing a gradual transition to a net emitter. This is because as a developed countries, perhaps we open more lands for development, and more energy is used for our consumption. Okay, next. Okay, why low carbon cities? So in Malaysia, the National Low Carbon City Initiative is basically an urbanization approach focusing on curtailing the anthropogenic carbon footprints of cities. So essentially, low carbon cities are cities that have comprehensive actions and definitive targets to reduce their environmental impact and greenhouse gas emissions. So cities have a direct influence on the demand of energy through green building policies, energy efficiency requirements, etc. A reduction in demand side will reduce the need for supply and therefore reduce the emission from the energy sector. So this initiative demonstrates that local government level have a supporting role to play in advancing low emission and climate resilient development towards Malaysia's NDC achievement, and support efforts toward a green, sustainable city and respond to sustainable development goals. So what we're trying to say here is efforts at local level does give impacts to our commitment to reduce our emission based on our NDC. Okay, next. All right. This is why low carbon cities matters for Malaysia. So firstly, in terms of GHG reduction at city levels, as I mentioned earlier, our commitment to reduce emission is intensity by 45% by 2030, relative to the emission intensity of GDP in 2005. So initiatives done by local government contribute these climate actions. Secondly, we want to leverage on our rich biodiversity. So Malaysia is committed to retain 50% of our forest area. This acts as our sinks. And also our urban biodiversity and carbon acts as carbon sequestration at city levels. Next is to promote green growth through green technology. According to Trust 5 in our midterm review of 11th Malaysia Plan. So we want to enhance environmental sustainability through green growth. And lastly, to improve for our quality of life, where we want to improve standards of living and ensure high quality environment. Next, I'm coming to my last slide. So we envision low carbon cities to have multiple direct and indirect benefits to the residents, businesses, and the cities. So the 5 key benefits are, in terms of clean, we would like to have clean air, where we reduce air pollution from fossil fuel vehicles, clean water to reduce pollution that is discharged into the rivers, clean land to reduce amount of waste that goes to the landfills. So in the area of cool, we want to have more cooling trees where extensive greenery and tree covers provide shades, cool buildings, green buildings and homes that retain less heat, and also cool cities. The overall urban heat island effect is reduced. In terms of health, we want healthy environment, healthy people, and also healthy businesses. In terms of livable, we are looking at affordability, where reduced costs from increased utility efficiency, also accessibility, multiple mobility options and connectivity. And lastly, resilient, where minimal disruption to shocks and stresses. And last thing that we want to achieve is to vibrant, where we focus on people, smaller city blocks that are pedestrian friendly, also integrated amenities and services to facilitate a green lifestyle. And lastly, urban biodiversity, where we incorporate the nature into the city development. So I think I've come to the end of my slides. Thank you. I pass over back to Deep.
Thank you, Encik Yusmazi, Deputy Under Secretary of Climate Change Division at the Ministry of Environment and Water, CASA. Right. So the next agenda, we will have a short icebreaking section. So everyone, you can switch on your camera, introduce yourself, name, where you come from, your agency, and which PBT you're from, and also what do you do, your role in your organization. I'll start with myself. My name is Deep Kumar. I'm the component manager for GTLCC project for component 1. Overseas policies and also GHG inventory for cities. And also joining me, we have Encik Norizal, who is our national project manager for the GTLCC project. And I believe Mr. Steve as well is with us. Maybe not, he left. Okay. All right, so I'll just go through the list. Yeah, maybe we'll start with Michael first, yeah.
Yes, thank you, Deep, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Michael Doust. I currently work at C40 as our Director of Measurement and Planning, and I've been working on inventories for the good part of the last 10 years, and I'm one of the authors of the GPC, and I look forward to sharing with you my experience to date. Thank you.
Sorry, can we have Puan Aimi Ayuni?
Mr. Dear, I think Ayuni is currently away from her desktop, so...
Okay, no problem. Can we have Puan Annie from Shalom? So okay, I'll just move on because we need to keep the time. So I'll have Ms. Chu from IRDA.
Hi, I'm Chu from IRDA. We're working on low carbon society in Iskandar, Malaysia. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Chu. Can we have one Dalila from Hang Tuah Jaya? No? Okay, I'll move on. Encik Hairi?
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Hairi
Hairi.
Punishan. I'm coming from MBSA, Majlis Bandara Shah Alam. I'm in engineering department. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Encik Hairi from MBSA. Can we have one Hana?
Hello, I'm Hana. I'm from IRDA. I'm currently looking at the possibility of having a data monitoring tool for Iskandar, Malaysia for GHG.
Thanks, Hana from IRDA. Can we have Puan Hidayah from DBKL? I'll just move on to the next one. Ibrahim.
So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ibrahim. Also with Mr. Deep from Sustainable Energy Development Authority, Malaysia, SEDA Malaysia. Basically, in view of developing the nation towards more sustainable energy and sustainable economy, we are focusing more on RE, but EE is also complementing the agenda. So this is the reason of my participation today, and I will look forward for the learning curve on this course. Thank you, Mr. Kumar.
Thank you, Encik Ibrahim, colleague at SEDA. Can we have Puan Izzati Arina? It's okay, no problem. If you're shy or something, you just introduce yourself at the chat box. We move on to Cairo Izzuddin. Fellow colleague.
Hi everyone. Yeah, from SEDA also. My name is Cairo Izzuddin, currently in Strategic Planning Division.
Thanks, Encik Cairo, for joining us, joining this training. Next, can we have Encik Muhammad Fari?
Hello everyone. Can you hear me? Hello.
Yeah,
Yes, my name is Muhammad Fari bin Zulkifli from Putrajaya Corporation, and I'm from Putrajaya Green City section. Okay, yes, thank you.
Thank you, Encik Fari, for joining this training. So an old friend of mine, Encik Fendi from Green Tech Malaysian Green Tech and Climate Change Center.
Hello everyone. I'm Fendi Mustafa. I'm from MGTC. Actually, I'm working on low carbon cities framework since 2013. Glad to meet you all.
Thanks, Fendi, for joining us this training. Can we have Ms. Nasha?
Hi everyone, good afternoon. I'm Nasha Lee, the Environment Analyst at UNDP Malaysia, and I work on climate change and energy.
Thanks, Ms. Nasha. Next, can we have Encik Nizam? This is the last registrant for this training from MBSP. Encik Nizam, you there? We'll move on. Puan Aslaili.
Hello, hi, good afternoon everyone. I'm Aslaili Mahmud. So I'm from Cities and Industry Division, Malaysian Green Technology and Climate Change Center. So I'm in charge of low carbon cities framework since 2011, 2010, 2011, like that. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Puan Aslaili. Can we have Puan Nur Nazwa from UNDP?
Hi everyone, my name is Nur Nazwa. I'm the Program Assistant from UNDP Malaysia, working for Climate Change and Urbanization Portfolio.
Thank you, Nazwa. Next, can we have Puan Norwani? Muhammad Noor.
Hello, hi everyone. I'm from Kulai Municipal Council. Has been taking care of low carbon action plan for Kulai for the last 4 years.
Welcome, Puan Norwani, to this training. All right. Next, can we have Puan? We have 2 accounts from you. It's okay, no worries. Can we have Puan Nur Wahida from our partner city, PJ?
Hello. Hi, my name is Nur Wahida from Petaling Jaya City Council. I've been in charging on low carbon project for PJ for the last 7 years now. Thank you.
Thank you, Puan Wahida. So Puan Wahida works with Mr. Lee, I think some of you may know from PBJ. Next, can we have Alex? So Alex Fang.
Hi everyone. I'm Alex from Iskandar, Malaysia. I'm involved in the greenhouse gas inventory for Iskandar, Malaysia, and also responsible for reporting and submission for CDP cities reporting. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. Can we have Encik Rozaidi?
Hi, hello everyone. I'm Rosadi from Hang Tuah Municipal Council. Currently work on a low carbon city project and GHG inventory monitoring report for the cities. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom Penner Rosadi, for joining this training. Next, we have landscape architect Ruhaila from Bisapang. Ada one.
Hi.
Oh, okay.
Right. I'm Ruhaila from MP Sepang Municipal Council, from the Smart City and Low Carbon City and Green Technology Division. Thank you.
Thank you, Puan Ruhaila, for joining this training. Next, we have Puan Ruzaino.
Hello everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Rusmana Arina Betuslan. I guess I'm called me just Arina. I'm from MP Clown, Engineering Department. Nice to see everyone.
Thank you, Puan Ruzaino. Who we have left? Puan Sharifah.
Hello everyone, I'm Sharifah Shahida. I'm from Iskandar Regional Development Authority, IRDA, involved in low carbon society development for Iskandar, Malaysia.
Thank you, Puan Sharifah. Then we have Puan Siti Haja, Nina.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Siti Haja Madina from the City Planning Department of City Hall of Kuala Lumpur. I'm currently working together as a team with other colleagues from Planning Department on doing our climate action plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Puan Siti Haja. Can we have Puan Siti Rusia? Puan, can you unmute yourself?
Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Siti Rusha binti Rani. I'm from City Planning Department. I in charge low carbon blueprint Kuala Lumpur. Thank you.
Thank you, Siti Rusha. So, for information, DBKL is working closely with C40 cities, developing their CAP, Climate Action Plan. Next, we have Mr. Tan from Green Tech.
Hello everyone, my name is Win Sim. You can call me Win if it's easier. I'm from MGTC and I'm with the advisory and consultancy divisions. So I'm working on quite a few roles, GHG projects on inventories in particular. Looking forward to the sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Win. I think last but not least, we have Tom Planner Wong.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Wong from Putrajaya, Federal Administrative Center of Malaysia, Green City section. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. If I skip or you're not able to introduce yourself, you can do it during the session. So the time is at 3 p.m. I think we're running a little bit late, but we'll try to catch up. So without further ado, so anyway, regarding questions, of course, this presentation will be done in the English language. But if you have questions in Malay and BM, okay, please do so. I'll just translate and Michael can answer your question. Yeah? So no worries in communicating in, but do not ask Michael in Malay lah. All right, he's not gonna answer. Okay, all right. So Michael, without further ado, I leave this into your good hands.
Thank you very much. I'm just trying to share my screen, so just bear with me 1 second whilst I get the presentation up and running. But it's a pleasure to meet all of you. Nice to see such a varied group, both from different cities and organizations, but also in terms of your experience and your role within your organization. So let me just bring up the slide sets. Just 1 second. This doesn't appear to be. I'm just going to switch off my screen to see if that helps with the bandwidth. Apologies for this delay. Deep, I've sent the presentation to you by email because I seem to have some issues uploading my presentation. If you've received it, could you upload it perhaps for me?
Do you have it in PowerPoint? No.
I sent you in a PDF file.
Okay. Give me a second. Is it good?
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Let's go full screen. All right.
Okay, and if you can give me also control of the presentation.
Can you try on your side? No.
I'm unable to at the moment.
Okay.
But I'll get started on this particular slide. So again, welcome everyone, and apologies for the delay in uploading the presentation. I'm delighted to be presenting to you today, and indeed for the next 7 sessions on the GPC. As I mentioned in my introduction, I'm one of the authors of the GPC, and I've worked supporting cities, but also I worked for the City of London before joining C40 on their inventories. I've got about 10 years of experience in greenhouse gas inventories, which I'm really keen to share with you today and over the next few sessions. The aims of today's training and again, the next 7 sessions are listed here on the screen. One is really to build an understanding of how an inventory can support climate action planning. Again, the purpose of an inventory is not just to collect data, it's to support action. So really to understand how an inventory can support climate action. The next one is really to develop an understanding of the emission sources in your city, and maybe perhaps to cast your understanding in broader to really look at all the different emission sources, the different gases that should be tallied in an inventory. Thirdly is to introduce the requirements of the GPC. So what is required to have an inventory that is compliant with the GPC, but also with the common reporting framework, which is run by the Global Covenant of Mayors. Both are very similar, and I'll explain the differences between the two. But I'll take you through all the detailed requirements to make sure your inventories are compliant with both those two standards. Next, we'll explore the data requirements and learn how you can manage data gaps and apply good data management practices. This is often one of the biggest challenges in producing an inventory. It's finding the right data and making sure the data fits the requirements of the inventory. So there are lots of different tricks you can use to sort of bend the data, to update the data to make sure it does indeed fit your city boundary or the boundary of the year or the requirements of the reporting standard. We'll learn how to use Cirrus, which is a greenhouse gas inventory reporting tool, and waste calculators. The waste calculators make it easier to estimate emissions from waste, which is often one of the most difficult sources to estimate accurately. and the Cirrus tool will allow you to report an inventory in line with the requirements of the GPC and the CRF, and then automatically upload this to CDP. I think one of you mentioned you're also involved in CDP reporting, and Cirrus is an accepted tool by CDP for reporting your greenhouse gas inventory. We'll also produce a draft inventory. As we go through the different modules, the different sections, we'll be producing a draft inventory in Cirrus eventually. This won't be the perfect inventory for your city, as we'll take a few shortcuts, but at the end of the 8 sessions, you will have a complete inventory for your city. Again, it won't be the most accurate one, but it will be a complete one. And then finally, during the last module, we'll develop an inventory action plan to really understand how you can further improve your inventory to meet the requirements of the GPC and or the CRF. So quite a selection of goals here, quite a broad aim, but it's really to make sure you have the understanding, you've got the skills, and at the end you have a draft inventory and an action plan to improve that one, so you can then fairly quickly after this session address those gaps and finalize your inventory. So those are the goals for today's training. Next slide, please. These are the modules. So starting in the top right, the first module is on the inventory boundary, and we'll discuss what makes an inventory boundary, how do we define the inventory boundary. Module B on Wednesday will be around how do we calculate emissions. So what are the shortcuts, what are the techniques, the methodologies to calculate emissions. Then we move into the different sectors covered by the GPC. So starting next week, Monday, with stationary energy, and these are emissions from buildings. Then next week, Wednesday, we'll focus on transportation. We'll then move on to waste. We'll then move on to IPP and AFOLU, which are the sectors covering industrial processes and land use emissions. And then during the final week, we will deep dive into Cirrus, which is the greenhouse gas tool we'll be using to compile an inventory. And we'll also be understanding how do you use your inventory going forward. So how do you communicate about your inventory? How do you use your inventory to produce a climate action plan, to set targets? But also how do you maintain the data quality, and how do you update the inventory on an ongoing basis? So those are the 8 modules we'll be covering over the next 4 weeks. Next slide, please. As we go through the module, we'll be doing a number of different exercises, and as I mentioned, we'll be compiling an inventory. And for that, you'll need the following. You'll need some key data about your city, population, GDP, and land area. You'll need a map of your city. This can be online, this can be a physical map. You'll need a calculator on your laptop, on your phone, or other. You'll need access to Mentimeter, and this is a tool we'll be using to run some quizzes. It's on www.mentee.com, and you can use that on your phone or on your laptop. I would recommend your phone, so you have a separate screen to the presentation today. You'll also need some basic Excel skills, and Cirrus is an Excel-based tool, and indeed Excel is the best tool to use, or the best software to use to compile an inventory. So we would strongly encourage you to, if you haven't yet, to make sure you brush up on some basic Excel skills. And you'll need 2 key documents, which is the Malaysian National Inventory, the 3rd biannual update report, and the National Energy Balance Report from 2017. Those 2 should have been shared with you before the session. They are saved in the Dropbox folder, and we'll be using those quite a bit throughout the course of the next few sessions. And that's because often city data isn't complete, or it doesn't quite fit the boundary you need, and we'll be using national data in those cases. So using both those reports is very critical for gap filling, but also we want to make sure our inventory is consistent with the national government in terms of emission factors used, in terms of boundaries. So it's very often useful to refer to those 2 documents in terms of emissions, but also in terms of energy consumption. Next slide, please. This is how I'm planning to run the session, through a combination of 4 sort of learning resources. One are presentations, so through PowerPoint, like we're doing now, and I'll be delivering content through that. I'll then run a number of quizzes through Mentee, and that's really to test your understanding, your knowledge of the content we've gone through, but also to make it fun and to break up the PowerPoints. We'll also do some exercises, and I've shared with you a workbook, again saved in the Dropbox folder, and that's where we'll do some practical work. We'll then apply the techniques, we'll start to do some calculations, and then finally we'll compile all of that into Cirrus, which is the Excel workbook. So those are the four tools I plan to use to run this session. So presentations for content, quizzes to test your understanding and to break it up and to make it a bit more fun. Exercises in the workbook to begin to compile your inventory and to test out some of those techniques, and Cirrus to bring everything together into the reporting format for your inventory. Next slide, please. So I was going to do the first exercise now, which we'll do through Mentee, and I'm just going to test your initial understanding of different acronyms, and there are GPC, Cirrus, GHG, GWP, AFOLU, EF, QA/QC, and BAU. So I'm going to ask you now all to switch over to Mentee so we can start to test out how Mentee works. So next slide, please. So if you can all go to www.mentee.com, again on another tab on your laptop, or ideally on your phone, which is easier, and type in the code 86792891. So I'll give you a second to do this. So www.mentee.com, and then you'll see this screen, and then type in the code 86792891, please. Okay, and then when you've logged in, you should see a big green screen, which says "Welcome to Mentee," and the heart in the middle. You can press the heart if you wanted to show you like the page. There's a you'll see that cloud of 3 dots below, which allows you to provide any comments if you want to, and I'll receive those comments. So we're going to start with exercise 1, which is on the acronyms that I've just shown you. And to start with, you'll be asked to either give your name. You don't have to give your real name. You can choose the name that they've given you. So we've got quite a few candidates already, and then we'll get started. So the first question is, what does GPC stand for? And you've got 20 seconds to type in your answer. So what does GPC stand for? Okay, and time's up. And I think most of you got that right, I can see. And the correct answer was, of course, the Global Protocol for Community-Scale Greenhouse Gas Emission Inventories. If you use GHG, you're right as well if you cut short. But I can see the answers, and most of you have got that right. So that's fantastic. So moving on to the next question. And what does Cirrus stand for? So this is a tool I mentioned before. What does Cirrus stand for? We've got 1 second left and time's up. Let's have a look at the answers. And again, this stands for the City Inventory Reporting and Information System. And I can see that most of you got that question right as well. So even if it's said wrong, it seems like a few of you got cut off on time or shortened a few words, but most of you have got that one spot on. So congratulations. So moving on to the next word. What does GHG stand for? So this is quite an easy question. What does GHG stand for? Okay, and time's up. Let's have a look at the answers. And yes, all of you got that one close or very close. It's of course greenhouse gas. Okay, and moving on to the next word. What does GWP stand for? GWP. This is a slightly more difficult one, so you've got a bit longer to answer this one. What does GWP stand for? Another 5 seconds. And time's up, and the answer is, of course, global warming potential, which most of you got. So congratulations. And again, I think if Mentee tells you it's the wrong answer, it might just be a spelling mistake, so don't worry about that. Next word, what does AFOLU stand for? What does AFOLU stand for? Again, this is a more tricky one. This is one of the 5 sectors covered by the GPC. What does AFOLU stand for? And it's actually a very important sector in the context of Malaysia. Another 10 seconds, if you know what AFOLU stands for. Okay, and time's up. And a lot of good answers here. Again, if the answer is, of course, agriculture, forestry, and other land use. I think quite a few have got that completely correct. Others maybe just missed a word here or there. But overall, this looks very good. Okay, moving on to the next word. What does EF stand for? What does EF stand for? Okay, another 10 seconds. What does EF stand for? Okay, a few seconds to go, and time's up. EF, of course, stands for emission factor or emissions factor. And again, most of you got that question right as well. So just got a few more to go. And the next one is, this is a difficult one. What does QA/QC stand for? QA/QC. This is a difficult one. It's a very important concept to inventories. We'll come on to this at the end, but it's a very critical concept. So if you don't know it, don't worry. We'll cover this in detail during the last session. But for now, let me just find out how many of you are familiar with the term QA/QC. And you've got another 5 seconds to go. Okay, and time's up. And QA/QC stands for quality assurance and quality control. And most of you got this right, actually. Again, don't worry about the spelling because I could only provide a few right answers. But I think most of you got this this completely right. So congratulations. Okay, next word. I think this is the last one. What does BAU stand for? What does BAU stand for? Okay, quite a few answers already. Another 10 seconds to go. What does BAU stand for?
Business as usual.
That is the right answer. So we'll just wait for 5 seconds for the mentee to finish. And time's up. And of course, it stands for business as usual. So congrats to all of those who got that question right. Okay, so we're going to go back to the presentation now.
Michael, could you try to upload again? Because I need the screen to assign participants to the breakout rooms.
Of course. Yeah, when I click on the share screen button, nothing comes up. It's not loading for some reason. It's not giving me any options.
Is the one beside the leave button? Nothing?
Yeah, yeah. When I press it, then the it's that sort of spinning cycle which isn't uploading anything.
All right. Could you open your PDF and then share your window instead?
Yeah, I can't share anything at the moment. That's the
No. Okay.
That's the problem I'm having.
And then that's okay. Then during the breakout session, you just have to give me some time to assign.
Yeah,
that's
fine.
Screen. Yeah. Okay.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we're going to start with module A now. So that was just an introduction, show you how mentee works and give you an overview of the broader course. But it seems like a lot of you already have a very good knowledge of inventories and greenhouse gas emissions. So that's fantastic. Next slide, please. So today we're going to cover 8 bits. The first is, why do we want to compile an inventory in the first place? What's the reason why we want to compile inventories in the first place? The second is then, why do we want to measure inventories at the city level? Why is it important that we as city practitioners measure emissions as opposed to just national government measuring emissions? Then I'll introduce you to the GPC and the accounting and reporting principles. We'll then move on to setting the inventory boundary. How do we define an inventory boundary? How do we categorize greenhouse gas emissions? And that's really talking about scopes, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. We'll then talk about reporting requirements. And finally, we'll come on to the common reporting framework, and I'll share with you the differences between the GPC and the common reporting framework. But in reality, they're very much the same thing. So moving on to the next slide, which is why compile a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Next slide, please. So first of all, what is an inventory? This is an inventory. This is what a summary inventory looks like in Cirrus, which is basically a record of greenhouse gas emissions broken down by, in this case, scope, and broken down by sector. It's the same as a financial budget. It just breaks down your emissions, where they come from, and it totals them up at the end. So it's a financial statement for greenhouse gas emissions, and this is what it looks like, what a GPC summary looks like. Next slide, please. It gives you a breakdown of greenhouse gas emissions. So in this case, we can see the breakdown between waste, transportation, and buildings, and within buildings between commercial buildings, residential buildings, manufacturing buildings. So it's a really good way of understanding where your emissions come from, not just the total emissions, but also how they break down between sectors and indeed between subsectors. Next slide, please. So they also allow you to track emissions over time. These are emissions, I think, for Boston in the US, and they allow you to see how emissions change over time. In this case, over the last 12 years. In the case of Boston, next slide, please. They allow you also to compare your emissions to population and GDP to see how any changes in population or GDP impact upon your total emissions. Next slide, please. But it's important to know that no inventory is perfect. And even when you see a fantastically complete inventory, it won't be a perfect inventory. And that is really because no data is perfect. All cities have gaps in their data, and they've got to make assumptions using scaling factors to estimate emissions. And this is actually considered good practice, provided the assumptions are disclosed. So even inventories for, the cities that have produced most inventories, or have done that for the last 10, 20 years, they all make assumptions, because it is very difficult to produce a fully accurate inventory at the city level, because measuring all the variables is very difficult. So all inventories make assumptions. All inventories use data that isn't perfect, and as such, data quality is an ongoing process, and something you need to focus on every time you republish and re-update your inventory to try and improve your inventory data quality. What this this chart actually shows is the data quality of reported inventories 2C40. The dark purple color shows very high data quality, and the light purple color shows poorer data quality. On the left, you have activity data. On the right, you have emission factor. So you can see that the data quality is considered higher for activity data than for emission factors. That's the first observation to make from this graph. And the second observation is to make is that data for buildings is generally tends to be better than data for waste. So waste tends to be a bit less certain compared to data for buildings. This is likely to be the same for your inventories, and it's no bad thing. Again, provided you acknowledge and you recognize the limitations and the assumptions that you've made, it is perfectly considered good practice to report an inventory, even if you're not fully sure about the data you're using. The key thing here is transparency. That's everything. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to move into breakout groups, and Deep's going to break you up into groups. And what I'd like you to do is to consider 3 different scenarios. And I'm going to ask you to prepare a short presentation. And again, this is just for you within the group to discuss. I won't be asking you to share that in plenary, but really just amongst yourself to discuss these 3 different cases. And the challenge, the task you're being asked to do is to prepare a short presentation to convince your mayor or your city leader or your senior management to produce an inventory or update your inventory aligned with the global protocol for community scale greenhouse gas emission inventory, so aligned with the GPC. And consider the different circumstances. For City A, you're about to host a large international climate conference next year. You've not updated your inventory since 2008, so your current inventory is 12 years old. You have a goal to reduce emissions by 80% in 2050 from 2000 levels. You do not have a climate action plan. So what arguments would you use to convince your mayor or your city leader to update your greenhouse gas inventory using the GPC? That's the City 1, City A. City B does not have an inventory and does not have an emission reduction target. The city is committed to the Global Covenant of Mayors. The city is very vulnerable to climate change and it suffers from air pollution. So what arguments would you use to convince your city or your mayor to produce an inventory if you were City B? City C has a recent inventory from 2015, but it's not GPC compliant. And the inventory shows much higher per capita emissions than cities next door. It's a big tourist destination all year round, as well as an important industrial area. So these are your 3 cities, and what I'd like you to do is to consider all 3 of them, and please take some notes already about these 3 cities, and then in turn, just as a group, discuss what would be your key arguments to convince your leader or your mayor or your senior management, if you were City A, to update your inventory. What arguments would you use if you were City B to produce your first inventory? And what argument would you use if you were City C to move to a GPC inventory? So I'm going to ask Deep now to put you into breakout groups for 5 to 10 minutes. And please consider these cities in turn, and as a group discuss what arguments you would use to convince your leadership or your director or your mayor to update or to produce a greenhouse gas inventory aligned to the GPC standard. Hi everyone, and welcome back. Yeah, I think I gather there's a bit of confusion because you can see the screen during your breakout session. So for next one, we'll make sure you're provided with that information alongside. But hopefully you did have a discussion around how do you convince your peers, your colleagues, your management, your leaders about the importance of compiling a greenhouse gas inventory. But without further ado, we'll start to make a move to the next session, which is on why do we measure emissions at the city level? Again, on this slide, we've set out a few of those reasons why. So it's important because planning for climate action begins with the greenhouse gas inventory. It's important to understand the emissions coming from different sectors. So is buildings the biggest sector? Is it from land? Is it from transportation? It's very important to understand what emissions come from which sectors. It's important to establish an emissions baseline, which then allows you to forecast future emissions. So are your emissions increasing? How quickly are they projected to increase? Or are they reducing? And how quickly are they expected to reduce? It's important for setting a greenhouse gas reduction target. If you don't know where you currently are, it's very difficult to commit to something in the future. But critically, and this is why it's in bold, It's important and it provides an evidence base to support development, implementation, and tracking of policies and actions. It helps you focus on climate action. It helps you understand which actions you should target and whether those actions are having an impact or not. So very important to have an inventory to allow you to focus on climate action and climate action planning. It's important also to compare, learn from, and share best practices with other cities. If you can't measure if you can't quantify the impact, it's difficult really to share the impact with other cities. It gives greater confidence for decision makers and investors. If they know you're able to compile an inventory, then more likely to have confidence in the decision they're making or they're being asked to support. It improves the city's reputation and allows you to attract investment. Often funders of projects, the big international donors or multilateral banks, want to see the city have in place an inventory so they can give assurance that they can actually monitor the impact of their investment. It helps to improve communication with businesses and residents. If you can show exactly why you're targeting these actions or why you're targeting those actions, or to show what progress you've actually made, it's important because it provides an evidence base to underpin your communication with residents and businesses. And finally, and not unimportant, it also helps you achieve compliance with different initiatives and organizational requirements. So for example, the Global Covenant of Mayors requires an inventory using the GPC and the Conduit Reporting Framework. So if you don't have that, you won't be eligible for membership there. So it is also important to become a member of these different organizations and to meet their eligibility requirements. But the most important reason for producing an inventory is because it provides an evidence base to identify actions and to track those actions over time. This is the cycle, and we're starting the top right, where we start with developing an inventory. That allows you then to establish a baseline and a forecast. On the basis of that, you can then set a reduction target. That target then informs a climate action plan. That informs climate actions. That then triggers the need to monitor progress. And you do that by developing another inventory to check progress. You then re-baseline, re-forecast, update your targets, update your climate action plan, rethink your actions, monitor progress again. So this is a cycle, the climate action planning cycle, with inventories very much a key part in the top right of this cycle. So now we're moving on to more detailed content, and this is an introduction to the GPC. So what is the GPC? I've got a copy here. It's a document that sets out how to measure emissions at the city scale. It's an accounting and reporting standard. And by accounting, I mean it tells you how to measure these emissions, and reporting, it tells you how to report those emissions. So it's both are important because really the key thing here is about communicating your greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not just how you measure them, it's also how you report them. And the GPC offers cities a robust, a transparent, a consistent, and a globally accepted framework to identify, to calculate, and to report on citywide greenhouse gas emissions. This is a really important slide. The GPC sets out requirements. It's a standard. It doesn't define a methodology. It recommends methodologies, but it doesn't define a methodology. You can choose your own methodology as long as it is considered robust and best practice. But the GPC sets out requirements for how you report and what you report, but it doesn't tell you how to calculate those emissions. Very often the GPC defers to the IPCC for methodologies, but you're also free to design and your own methodology, as long as you're transparent about your methodology that you've used. So transparency is critical, but the GPC is very much a requirements-based framework, a standard, and it doesn't specify a methodology to use for a particular sector. The GPC is broken down into, those requirements are broken down into 3 buckets: shall, should, and may. And these are 3 very common international standard definitions. Shall indicates something that is required. It's a must. You have to complete those sections to be compliant with the GPC. So shall refers to a must. Should is a recommendation. It's nice to have, but it's not mandatory. It's recommended, but it's not a requirement. And may is optional. It's a very nice to have, but it's by certainly no means recommended or required. So in the GPC, you'll see this language, and it's very specific language. So whenever you see shall, you must report that. It's not optional, it's a must. If you see should, it's recommended, but it's not required. And may means it's optional. It's a nice to have. If you have the time, the data, or the resources, by all means, report those emissions, but it's not expected or required. So this is the difference that the GPC is hoping to make. Before the GPC was published in 2014, there were many different standards that cities were using, and there was no real consistent approach to reporting greenhouse gas emissions. So what the GPC is aiming to achieve is, rather than having all different cities report emissions in different formats, is to have one type for measurement, which allows for comparability across different cities, across geographies. We also had differences in the boundary, like what emissions were measured. So before the GPC, those different standards often measure different things, which again makes comparison very difficult. And the GPC now has a very clear, consistent standard that accounts for all emissions taking place within a city boundary. And because it's based on IPCC methodologies and the IPCC approach, it allows you to relate your city inventory to the national government. So it does forge those links between national inventories and city inventories to allow for better coordination across the work at national government and at city government. The GPC is broken down into 3 parts. The first is an introduction and setting out the reporting requirements. So it's more around what is required. Part 2 gives guidance on how to calculate emissions by emission source. So it tells you what are the recommended methodologies or the approaches for measuring emissions from buildings, from transportation, from waste, etc. And part 3 gives guidance on how do you track changes over time in an inventory. So how do you use it as a tool going forward to track changes in emissions, but also how do you use the GPC to set goals and targets. So 3 different sections, the key ones being the first and the second, setting out the reporting requirements and providing guidance on different emission sources. And this slide just shows you what you can achieve. These are emissions data for around 40 cities, showing the differences in their emissions profile, with blue being buildings, red being transportation, and green being waste. And you can start to see some differences here. In the sort of, particularly for European and North American cities, a huge focus on emissions from buildings, and then transportation, and then waste. In some African cities, a very big focus on waste. So here at the bottom, we have a huge slice of the pie taken up by emissions coming from waste. But also in Latin America, for example, much bigger emissions from transportation, whereas Asia has a profile more like those of European cities, with most emissions coming from buildings, then transportation, and then waste. But this is what an inventory can tell you, and particularly useful when you're comparing emissions between different cities. Okay, so next we're going to move on to accounting and reporting principles. And these really underpin the GPC. These are useful when you get stuck and you're not sure what to do. You can always refer to these accounting and reporting principles to help you guide the way. So the GPC has 5 reporting and accounting principles. The first is relevance. And this really is around you should prioritize your data and your emissions based on the priorities of the city. It has to be relevant for the city. There's no point collecting data that you don't use anywhere else in your city. So make sure the inventory is relevant to your city. Number two, it's complete. Make sure you measure all sectors and all emissions. And if you can't, explain why not. Just reporting an emissions inventory with just emissions from buildings is not a fair reflection of the emissions in your city, because you also have cars in your city, buses, and you produce waste. So completeness is a very important principle. Consistency is critical. It is important when we're comparing emissions between years, but also between cities, that you apply the same boundary and the same approach. Otherwise, you're not comparing like with like. So make sure your assumptions are consistent, your boundaries are consistent, your data sources are consistent, your emission categories, sectors are consistent, your methodologies are consistent between years, as well as allowing comparison across different cities. And this is really why the GPC was designed, is to ensure consistency when comparing emissions inventories across different cities. Number 4, transparency. For someone to trust your inventory, they need to be able to interrogate it. So clear documentation and disclosure of data sources, assumptions, and methodologies is critical to give confidence to businesses, to other stakeholders, to the public, to peer cities, that your inventory is indeed produced using best practice and hasn't been made up. So transparency is a critical principle. And the final one is accuracy. We want to produce an accurate inventory, of course. So we want to make sure there is integrity of data, assumptions, and calculations. So when you make an assumption, make sure it's as accurate as possible. Don't make it up, but make sure it's based upon local conditions and local factors. And this to make sure you don't under-report your emissions, but also likewise, you don't over-report your emissions. So accuracy is also important. Now, quite often when you're producing inventory, these principles will crash. They won't be fully aligned. So there'll be a trade-off between different inventories. For example, with completeness and accuracy, you can spend years and years, producing the most accurate inventory, and you may say, actually, I'm not going to report my inventory because the data is inaccurate. Or you could say, I'm going to report my inventory and make sure it's complete, but I'll use less accurate data. So there is a trade-off between these two principles, where you might go completely accurate, but you may just have accurate data for 2 sectors, and therefore you may leave off 1 sector, so it's not complete. Or you might say, actually, I'm going to focus on a complete inventory, but recognize my data for waste isn't that accurate, but I'll use a less accurate data source, or I'll make an assumption. So there was a trade-off to be made between these 2 inventories, and you'll see this quite often. And in that case, you go back to these different principles and decide, well, actually, what is important? And I'll repeat them again, because the next breakout exercise is really focusing on this activity. We'll be looking at the trade-offs between principles. So relevance, your data and your inventory is really relevant for your city. Don't use data sources you don't use anywhere else. Use data sources you already use, because that makes it more relevant to your city, to your other departments. Make sure your inventory is relevant. Second, aim for completeness where you can. An incomplete inventory doesn't really provide a valid comparison with other cities, for example. Where you don't have data, explain it. Consistency, make sure that over time your inventory is consistent, you're using the same approach, but also between cities, there's an important element there to make sure what you're reporting is consistent with what someone else is reporting, to allow that comparison to take place. Number 4, transparency. It's critical. Always disclose all your assumptions, all your methodologies. And finally, accuracy is important. Ensuring integrity of data and assumptions and calculations. So where you try and be as accurate as you can to make sure you're not under-reporting, but likewise, you're not over-reporting as well. So hopefully you've kind of a good idea of these different definitions: relevance, completeness, consistency, transparency, and accuracy. And next we're going to move into another exercise, and I'm going to ask, and we're going to compare, we're going to be discussing different principles and the potential conflict between those principles. So accuracy and completeness, what's the potential conflict there? Transparency and completeness, what's the conflict there? Consistency and accuracy, what's the conflict there? Relevance and completeness, what's the conflict there? So next, I'm going to ask you to go back into Mentimeter and to go back. So go to mentee.com. If you've left the site, dial in the code 86792891. And I'm just going to share my screen so that I can bring it up. Just 1 second. Okay, so we've got exercise 2, accounting principles, and I'm going to ask Deep to put you back into breakout groups, and then what I'll do is I'll show the conflict on the screen here, so you have it on your phone or on your second tab, and then yeah, I'm keen to get your feedback. So break out into groups. You'll then see the conflict. You'll then have 2 or 3 minutes per conflict to type in what you think the conflict is, and you can either type it in as a group, so one person types everything in for the group, or you can type it in individually, and then we'll have a look at the answers and then move on to the next conflict. So if we can move into breakout groups, Deep, that would be great. And if you could let me know once everyone's in the breakout groups, I'll then start the mentee exercise.
All right, so I think earlier we had issues with the breakout room. So when I click breakout rooms, every participant will enter into your rooms, and so Michael, they'll be discussing over what is on the Mentimeter, right?
Correct. Yes. So I'll take you in turn through the different conflicts. Every time we'll see 2 principles, and I want you to think about what's the conflict between those 2 principles, and then type in your answer into Mentimeter, either as a group or individually.
All right. So I'm starting the room now. All right, Michael, everyone's in their rooms.
Great, thank you. Yeah, if there's an issue with the breakout groups, I'm happy to run these in plenary as well, if that's easier. But let's see how this one goes. And Deep will go into a short break after this one.
Oh, okay, sure. Sorry, Michael, going from room to room.
What's that?
I was just going from room to room just to see how it's going.
Okay,
So there was discussion going on. Some was still confused.
Okay, confused about the instructions?
I think they needed something to refer.
Okay.
While discussing, so I
Okay, so maybe next time we send a PDF beforehand. Would that be helpful?
Correct.
Okay, that sounds good.
I think we'll do that. Yeah, that'll be easy. So they can just refer and have a proper discussion.
Yeah.
This mentee is still going on, right?
Yeah, we're just we're moving on to the moving on to the last one.
Okay.
How many groups have you got, Deep?
Sorry, 7 groups.
Okay.
Sounds okay.
Okay, Deep, if you want to bring them all back into plenary, and then we'll just go through the answers, and then we'll break for a 5-minute break.
Right.
Hello.
Is everyone back in plenary?
Yeah.
Everyone's back, Michael. All the rooms
fantastic.
are closed. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Great, thanks for doing the exercise. I was able to follow your answers on the screen. You can see some here, and some really good answers. Some clearly some very good thinking around those conflicts. So we've got one here on relevance and completeness. you know, and it's really understanding the issue around, you know, for example, the first comment here about data not being used with industry, but missing certain key parameters or information. And in each of these, it's your task as an industry compiler to decide where the balance lies. And again, the image I showed was that of a seesaw, which means there's no right or wrong answer. It's your opinion. It's your evaluation of the balance between those two principles. Which one is more important, or how do you trade those off against each other? And every time you come to a point where you're not sure what to do, where you think actually this is an issue, always refer back to these 5 principles and decide what's a trade-off. What's more important for my city, for the data to be relevant or to be complete, for the data to be accurate or to be consistent. Just always refer back to those different different principles. So just to go through the ones I shared earlier. So in terms of accuracy and completeness, you know, the best data may not be available, but less good quality data exists, but that gives you a complete inventory. Transparency and completeness. Some data may be confidential, and to have a complete inventory, but you can't disclose the confidential data. So what do you do there? Consistency and accuracy. The most accurate data may not follow the same methodology as other data. So how do you balance that? And last one, relevance and completeness. Yeah, the data you might be using may not be the most relevant data or priority data for your city. So these conflicts will always occur. They will always take place. So the challenge you've got as an inventory compiler, as an inventory expert, is to balance them up and decide what is most important for your city. And no one else can give you a right or wrong answer. It's your decision. It's your evaluation. So every time you feel there's a conflict, it's for you to make that decision, talk to your colleagues, but make sure ultimately it's your decision and not someone else's. And again, don't feel like there has to be right or wrong answer. It can't be one over the other. It's done within the context of your city, your capacity, your resources, and your priorities. So with that, I propose we take a short 5-minute break, just to give you a chance to have a toilet break or get a drink or just to stretch your legs. So we'll reconvene at 20 past, deep is that 4 o'clock? Okay, Malaysia time? 20 past 5. So we'll reconvene in 5 minutes, and then we'll start again. Yeah, so back in 5 minutes, please. Everyone. So now moving into the 5th part of today's module. We're going to talk about the inventory boundary, which is really how you define what is included in your inventory. I had planned a quiz before this, but we're running out of time a bit, so I'm going to skip the quiz. We'll do that next session, hopefully, and I'll move into the content. So your inventory boundary is made up of really essentially 4 different components. One is the area, which could be any geographic area. This could be a ward, a neighborhood, a town, a city, a region. It could be any geographic area. The important thing is to define what that area is. The time span, it needs to be a period of 12 months. And that could be either from January to December, it could be from April to March, from June to May, but it needs to be 12 continuous months. Greenhouse gases. The Kyoto Protocol includes 7 greenhouse gases, and the GPC covers 3 of those, the rest being optional. So carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide are mandatory, they are shalls, and HFCs, PFCs, SF6, and NF3 are optional, they are shoulds. Next one, emission sources. For the GPC, you need to report emissions from stationary energy, which is a word for buildings. It's another term for buildings. Transportation and waste, with emissions from IPPU, the industrial processes and product use, and from AFOLU, agriculture, forestry, and other land use being optional. So these are the 4 most important aspects that define your emissions boundary: your area, the time period, the gases, and the emission sources. So focusing on greenhouse gases first of all, combustion of fossil fuels in homes, vehicles and power stations release large amounts of carbon dioxide and smaller amounts of methane and nitrous oxide. So emissions from buildings and transportation release CO2, CH4 and N2O. Decomposition of organic materials in solid waste landfill, essentially in disposal sites, releases methane, CH4, and biogenic CO2. And by biogenic CO2, we mean carbon dioxide from trees, from organic sources, as opposed to fossil sources. So whenever you see the B behind CO2, it refers to biogenic carbon, which is carbon dioxide from trees and from the land, as opposed to from fossil fuels like oil, coal, or gas. So now we'll go through each of those different sectors in turn. So the first is stationary energy, which is often the biggest source for any city. And these emissions come from the combustion of fuel in residential, commercial, and institutional buildings and facilities, as well as in factories and other manufacturing plants. It also includes the power used to generate electricity. So your electricity from your cooling in buildings is also captured, as is any primary energy combustion, like if you're cooking gas in your home, or if you're using kerosene sort of heaters, for example. The sector also includes fugitive emissions, and these are emissions basically where you release these gases as a side process of industrial activities. So they don't tend to be very big, particularly not in cities, but we'll come into this in a bit more detail next week when we go through this sector in much more detail. The stationary energy sector is made up of different subsectors, namely residential buildings where people live, commercial and institutional buildings and facilities, businesses, but also public sector buildings, manufacturing industries and construction sites, so factories and building sites, energy industries, where you generate energy, and we also have a sector for agriculture, forestry and fishing activities, and this tends to be sort of farms, etc., for agriculture, and as I mentioned, fugitive emissions, which are accidental releases of greenhouse gases caused by use of fossil fuels. Then moving on to transportation. Transportation covers all journeys by road, by rail, by water, and by air, including intercity, so between cities, and international travel. These emissions come directly from the combustion of fuel or indirectly by the use of grid-supplied electricity. So, for example, we have your petrol-powered vehicle burns fossil fuels, releases greenhouse gases, or your electric vehicle uses electricity, but that electricity comes from a coal-fired power station. Collecting data of transportation is often very difficult because it's a very mobile source of emissions, difficult to track, and so quite often we make a number of assumptions in estimating emissions from transportation. These are the 5 sectors: on-road, railways, aviation, waterborne, and off-road emissions. Moving on to waste. So waste disposal and treatment produces greenhouse gas emissions through both aerobic and anaerobic decomposition or incineration. Aerobic means with oxygen, anaerobic means without oxygen. And greenhouse gas emissions will be calculated by their route of disposal. So how they're disposed tells you how to measure those emissions. And the GPC covers 4 disposal routes, namely landfill, biological treatment like composting, incineration, and open burning. If methane is recovered from solid waste or from wastewater treatment and used as an energy source, it then gets reported under stationary energy. So any gas that's used for energy gets reported under stationary energy. But if it is not collected or burnt on site without use of energy, it comes under waste. And we'll come on to this when we deep dive into waste. But that's a really important thing to consider. If any gas released from waste is captured, which often is in landfill sites, it's there and used for energy, it's then reported under energy rather than waste. But if it's just burnt at the landfill site or not collected at all and lost to the atmosphere, it's reported under waste. And as I mentioned, there are 4 categories here: solid waste disposal, which is landfill sites; biological treatment, like composting; incineration and open burning, where you simply burn the waste either in a controlled facility or not; and wastewater treatment. So those are the 3 mandatory sectors covered by the GPC. There are 2 additional optional sectors, and that is industrial processes and product use. And these are emissions that come from chemical plants, from metal plants. This is basically industry that is producing chemicals, minerals, and where they release often huge amounts of greenhouse gases. But this also includes products that we use, like refrigerators, like aerosol cans, and often these contain greenhouse gases which are released during use. And this also includes air conditioning units. They contain very trace amounts of greenhouse gases, but nonetheless, they contain greenhouse gases. And this includes 2 categories: industrial processes and product use. So the final sort of category is agriculture, forestry, and other land use. And these are emissions that come from livestock, so from cows, from chickens. They come from land use management. So, for example, if you're growing rice, there's emissions associated with that. If you apply fertilizer to the soil, that fertilizer often releases greenhouse gases. If you're changing land use, say going from forest land to urban land, that also releases greenhouse gas emissions. Conversely, if you go from urban land to forestry, you're capturing emissions. So land use often has a big greenhouse gas impact. Again, as we saw in the slide at the beginning, a huge impact in Malaysia. And there are 3 categories called livestock, land, and aggregate sources. So those are your 5 sectors covered by the GPC: stationary energy, transportation, waste. Those are the 3 mandatory sectors. You must report on those for your inventory to be GPC compliant. There are 2 optional sectors, IPPU and AFOLU. They're recommended, but they're not required as part of the GPC. Okay, so next we're going to go back to mentee and do a quiz. So I'll give you one final chance to look at this slide, at the sectors and the subsectors. So stationary energy, we have residential, commercial and institutional, manufacturing and energy industries, and other and fugitive. Transportation, road, railways, waterborne navigation, in other words, boats, aviation and off-road. And on the waste, we have solid waste, biological treatment, incineration and open burning, and wastewater treatment. Okay, so next we're going to go back to mentee, and I'm going to show you these different emission sources, and I'm going to ask you to correct the right sector. So if you can all please go back to mentee, and I'll change my screen to show you the mentee screen again. Here we go. So if everyone can please dial back into mentee using the code 86792891. We'll then do the quiz quickly in mentee. So I'll give you a few seconds to go back into mentee, but it's the same code as before for those of you that dialed out, 86792891 at mentee.com. Okay, so moving on to the first task. Diesel used by buses, which sector does that come under? Is that on-road transportation, commercial and institutional buildings, off-road transportation, or fugitive emissions? And everyone's going for on-road transportation because that is the right answer. Fantastic. Okay, next one. Electricity used for street lighting. Is that on-road transportation? Is that commercial and institutional buildings and facilities, off-road transportation, or fugitive emissions? Okay, we're a bit more split on this one, but the majority have got this right. Street lighting comes under commercial and institutional because it is often managed by the city authority, and therefore it's a public service and a public utility, and it comes under commercial and institutional buildings and facilities. Next one. Electricity consumption in shopping centres. Is that energy industries, manufacturing industries and construction, fugitive emissions, or commercial and institutional buildings and facilities? Okay, and everyone's got that one right, because it is, of course, commercial. It's a commercial building and therefore comes under that category. Next one, methane gas release from landfill. Is that energy industries, solid waste disposal, biological treatment, or livestock? Okay, this is a bit of a trick question. It's actually solid waste disposal. So those who picked the middle one got it right. But if the methane gas is captured and used for energy, then it would fall under energy industry. But because it's methane gas release, it means it's released to the atmosphere, therefore it comes under waste. If it would have been captured and used for energy, it would have been under energy industries. Methane gas released from a gas distribution network. This is a difficult question. Is that energy industries, fugitive emissions, biological treatments, or commercial and institutional buildings and facilities? Okay, just a few more to answer. And it is in fact a fugitive emission. It is a release from a network where it has no use, but it's just released as part of leaks during the network, and that is what we call a fugitive emission. And we'll come on to this next week in much more detail. Kerosene used by helicopter ambulances. Is that commercial and institutional buildings and facilities? Is that aviation, energy industries, or manufacturing industries and construction? Kerosene used by helicopter ambulances. Okay, it is aviation, so the majority of you got that right, because it's a helicopter, it flies, and it's therefore captured under aviation. Okay, next one. Composting of organic waste. Is that wastewater, solid waste disposal, livestock, biological treatment of waste? Okay, and most of you got this one right as well. Composting actually comes under biological treatment of waste, so the 92% have got this right. Last one. Gas used for home cooking. Is that solid waste disposal, commercial and institutional buildings and facilities, on-road transportation, or residential buildings? And everyone's got that one right. So well done. So that's the end of that mentee, and let me go back to my presentation. So it sounds like all of you have a really good understanding of the sectors so far, which is fantastic. So well done. Okay, so now we're moving on to categorizing greenhouse gas emissions, and this is all about scopes. So you're going to be learning all about different scopes. So all activities taking place in a city can generate emissions that occur either inside the city boundary, but also outside the city boundary. And to distinguish between these two and avoid double counting critically, the GPC categorizes all emissions into 3 scopes. Scope 1 are all emissions from sources located within the city boundary, where the emissions actually take place inside the city, so physically inside the city. Scope 2 are emissions from the use of grid-supplied energy within the city, but often where the power is generated outside the city. So the physical emissions take place outside the city, but the consumption of energy takes place inside the city. So scope 2 is where you have a power station outside the city, but the consumption of the energy inside the city. And that is often used for electricity, but also where you have heating or cooling networks that stretch beyond the city boundary. But I think in your case, scope 2 will only refer to electricity. And scope 3 is everything else. All other emissions that occur outside the city boundary as a result of activity within the city boundary. So for example, if you buy a television, that television was made, say, in China or in Indonesia, there are emissions associated with producing the television in China or Indonesia, but you're using it and you're buying it in the city. So that's an example of a scope 3 emission, where the emissions take place somewhere else from where you're actually enjoying the television. So just to recap, scope 1 is a physical emission within the city boundary. If you're burning, if you're having a fire or you're driving your car, the emissions take place inside your city. It is scope 1. Scope 2 is if you're using energy if you're using any electricity, either in a vehicle or at home. That is a scope 2 emission because the power station is often outside your city boundary. Scope 3 refers to everything else that you use that will have been produced outside your city boundary. So if you're buying a television from China, there are emissions that have gone into that television, but those are scope 3 because they were made in China, whereas the emissions from using the television come from electricity, which is scope 2. The Common Reporting Framework uses different language. So for scope 1, they talk about direct emissions. For scope 2, they talk about indirect emissions. And scope 3, they talk about other indirect. They mean exactly the same thing, just different languages. So scope 1 is a direct emission, scope 2 indirect, and scope 3 other indirect. And I'll show you how this all works in the next set of diagrams. So scope 1, assuming that the box is your city boundary, scope 1 includes all your emissions that physically take place inside your city boundary, from any fuel combustion inside your house, from any waste generated and disposed in your city, from any in-boundary transportation, from any in-boundary agriculture, or from any factories within the city. Scope 1 is always within the city boundary. Scope 2 is where you're using grid-supplied energy, you're using electricity from a regional grid, but that is used to power your buildings, provide your air conditioning, and run your trains, for example. So scope 2 is power generated outside your city, but utilized within your city. And scope 3 is basically where you have emissions that are generated because of activity in your city and by your residents. They take place outside your city. So this includes things you buy that are produced elsewhere, but also if you go on holiday, for example, if you fly to, so you're flying to Bali or you're flying to London, you as a citizen of your city is responsible for those emissions being generated, but they take place outside your city boundary, so they would fall under scope 3. So scope 3 is everything that you buy or use, but where the emissions take place outside your city boundary. Okay, so we're going to do another quick exercise just to test your understanding of scopes. So let me just recap quickly. Scope 1, all emissions physically being released from inside your city. Scope 2, all emissions from the consumption of electricity. And scope 3 is everything else that is used by your city residents or your businesses, but where the emissions take place outside your city. Okay, so we're going to go back to mentee. So let me just quickly share my screen again and go back to mentee. Here we go. And let me bring it up again. just seem to have lost the screen. Okay. So again, mentee.com, code 86792891, and we're going to test your knowledge of scopes. Okay, so first one, diesel used by buses within the city, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Is of course right, because those emissions take place physically within your city. Electricity used for street lighting within the city, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Okay, this is actually scope 2. So those who chose scope 1, we're using electricity. Every time you use electricity, it's a scope 2 emission. And that is because the power station is often outside your city boundary. In any case, you're often using a regional grid. So electricity is always scope 2. Next one, I've just given the answer away. Electricity consumption in schools within the city. Okay, is of course a scope 2 because it's about electricity consumption. Methane gas release from a landfill outside the city. Is that scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3? There's a good question there. I'll answer that question at the end, but thank you for raising that question. This is scope 3 because it's outside the city. So the emissions take place outside the city, hence it's a scope 3 emission source. Methane gas release from gas distribution network inside the city. Okay, so more of a mixed answer here. It is scope 1 because it's inside the city, and again, it's a methane gas release. It's not being used to generate energy, so it's a scope 1 source, and it takes place inside the city. So anything inside the city is always scope 1. Anything outside could be scope 2 or scope 3. If it's energy generation, electricity, it's scope 2. Anything else is scope 3. Just to respond to the question we just had, remind, well, what if the power is generated inside the city? In that case, it is still scope 2 for electricity because often it is part of a regional grid. And so for the sake of and you don't exactly know whether that power generated inside your city actually goes to your buildings or goes to other buildings. So if you're part of a regional grid, then electricity is always considered scope 2. Even if you have 1 or 2 power stations inside your city, it is still always scope 2 because it's part of a much bigger network within the region, or even indeed within the country. There's a question in the chat box which has already been answered. Great, so I can move on. Okay, again, we're going back to the helicopter example. Kerosene used by city helicopter ambulances outside the city. So kerosene used by city helicopter ambulances outside the city. Scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. And that's scope 3 is indeed right. Again, it's kerosene is a combustible fuel, and it's outside the city, so it's scope 3. Scope 2 again is only for electricity, not for any primary fuels. Anything that you can burn is a primary fuel, and that is scope 1 or scope 3. Electricity is always scope 2. Okay, composting of organic waste within the city, scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3. Okay, and that's a full house, scope 1, of course, so congratulations, everyone. And the final one, gas used for home cooking within the city, scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3. Okay, and everyone's got that right as well. So congratulations. So great. So you'll have a pretty good understanding of the differences between Scope 1 and Scope 2. I appreciate that the question around Scope 1 and Scope 2 for electricity can sometimes be confusing, but generally assume that electricity is always Scope 2. Even if you have a power station inside your city boundary, because it's part of a regional network or a national network, you don't know exactly where your power goes. It could go to your building next door, but it could also go to the wider network. So electricity is always considered part of Scope 2. Okay, so moving on to the next one, we're now talking about the reporting requirements, and this really comes down to the heart of the GPC. So what is the GPC about, and what is different about the GPC? And the key thing here is the GPC presents two reporting frameworks, a territorial framework and a city-induced framework, and they are very different things, and it's very important to know the difference between the two. The territorial framework adds up all Scope 1 emissions, so all the emissions that just take place inside your city, just Scope 1 emissions. So it only includes emissions produced within the geographic boundary of your city, and this is consistent with the national level greenhouse gas reporting. So at the national level, the reporting framework is to only report emissions from within your country, your territory, and the territorial approach aligns with that by just adding up emissions that take place physically inside your city. So that is Scope 1 emissions only. The city-induced framework takes a slightly different approach and actually looks at emissions that your city is responsible for. So it includes emissions that take place both inside your city, but also outside your city. And therefore covers emissions from Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. So we have two frameworks: territorial, only Scope 1, only emissions that take place physically inside your city, and city-induced, which covers Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3, and looks at what the city is responsible for, both inside but also outside the city boundary. So let's focus on city-induced for now. So it looks at all the emissions that the city is responsible for, and as I mentioned, it covers Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. And under city-induced, the GPC has two levels, a basic level and a basic plus level. And in the table here, you can see the difference between basic and basic plus. The basic is the bare minimum. If you want to be GPC compliant, you need to have a basic level inventory. Basic plus is optional. So for basic, you should measure stationary energy, transportation, and waste. And for basic plus, it also includes IPPU and AFOLU. So two levels, basic and basic plus. For these webinars, we're going to cover all sources covered by basic and basic plus. But when you come to produce your own inventory, bear in mind you should only focus on basic unless you want to really aim for basic plus. But basic is mandatory and basic plus is optional. So the difference between basic and basic plus. So this looks at the city-induced framework and at the basic level. And at the basic level, we have emissions from buildings. So this is fuel combustion in buildings, if you're cooking with gas or kerosene, for example, and the use of electricity in buildings for air conditioning, for lighting, for your computers, but also in offices, etc. It looks at transportation within the city boundary, by cars combusting, burning petrol or diesel, but also by trains using electricity. And it looks at waste generated by the city, but also and broken down into waste that is disposed in the city, so Scope 1, but also waste that is disposed outside the city. So if you send any waste outside the city, then it's considered Scope 3. So this is your basic boundary. It covers Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, mostly Scope 1, but also Scope 2 from electricity, and Scope 3 from any waste that is sent outside the city boundary for treatment or for disposal. Then basic plus, and you can see the difference between basic and basic plus. So basic plus adds your AFOLU, your agriculture, forestry, and land use, and your industrial processes to the individual boundary, but it also adds potential scope 3 emissions. So these are shall. You shall report these emissions. These are should, they're recommended, and these are may, these are optional. So this is, for example, anything, any travel outside the city, or any transmission and distribution losses outside the city are also needing to be reported. So this includes, for example, if you fly to another city or to fly to another country, but also if there is a train, that goes, say, from your city to another city, that's also considered out-of-boundary transportation, and any of those emissions you can capture under scope 3 because they take place outside your city boundary. Okay, so we have territorial and city-induced. A key difference there being the emissions that physically take place in your city, as opposed to the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 framework captured by the city-induced framework, which looks at what the city is responsible for. And secondly, we're looking at the difference between basic and basic plus, with basic just focusing on buildings, transportation and waste in city, scope 2, but also just waste from waste generated but disposed outside the city. And under basic plus, we're also including agriculture, forestry and land use, industrial processes, waste disposed outside your city, transmission and distribution losses. When you have the big power networks that transfer your electricity, they typically lose a percentage of power during that transmission process. That takes place outside your city, and also any travel that takes place outside your city but driven by your city comes under scope 3. Okay, so we're going to go back to mentee now. I'm going to ask you to determine whether you should report these emissions under basic or basic plus. Okay, so let's go back to Mentimeter, and let me just share my screen again with you. And we're going to ask you the same questions, but this time focusing on reporting framework rather than focusing on scope. Okay, so reporting level. And the first question is industrial processes in the cities. That's basic or basic plus? Okay, a bit of a split here, but most of you got this right. This is basic plus. So all industrial processes are reported under basic plus. Factories are reported under basic, but industrial processes refer to particular processes, and they come under basic plus. And again, if you got this wrong, don't worry about it. This is new, and this is not always very straightforward. And we'll answer this in more detail during the sector-focused webinars. Next one, wastewater generated inside the city, but treated outside the city. Is that basic or basic plus? Okay, and again, most of you got this right. This is basic because all waste generated by the city, whether it's treated inside or outside, comes under basic. So this was the right answer here, was basic. Next one, scope 1 emissions from residential buildings in the city. Scope 1 emissions from residential buildings in the city. Is that basic or basic plus? Okay, most of you got this right. This is indeed basic because residential buildings is one of the mandatory sectors in the GPC, and therefore comes under basic. Scope 3 emissions from aviation serving the city. Scope 3 emissions from aviation serving the city. Is that scope 1? Sorry, is that basic or basic plus? Okay, and again, a slightly mixed answer here. The right answer is basic plus, because scope 3 emissions for transportation are considered basic plus, because they take place outside your city. It's very rare that you have planes flying within your city, but because of scope 3, the emissions take place outside your city, and therefore it comes under basic plus. Scope 3 emissions from disposal of solid waste, is that basic or basic plus? Scope 3 emissions from disposal of solid waste, basic or basic plus? Okay, and again, most of you have this right. All scope 3 emissions from waste are reported under basic because they're generated by your city. So it's waste physically generated in your city, but disposed outside, it still comes under basic. Enteric fermentation by cows in the city, and by enteric fermentation, we mean farting by cows. So enteric fermentation by cows in the city, are those emissions basic or basic plus? Okay, and everyone's gone for a basic plus. One person's going for basic. The correct answer is basic plus. Enteric fermentation comes under a FOLU, and a FOLU as a sector as a whole comes under basic plus. So remember, the 3 mandatory sectors under basic are stationary energy, buildings, transportation and waste, and a FOLU, agriculture and land use, as well as IPPU come under basic plus. So enteric fermentation from cows falls under a FOLU, and therefore comes under basic plus. Next one, fugitive emissions from natural gas systems in the city. Okay, still a few people to answer. Okay, most of you have this right. Remember, fugitive emissions comes under stationary energy. It was that last subsector under stationary energy, because it's a physical release of emissions. It's a physical release of emissions in the city, so therefore it comes under basic, and not basic plus, because it falls under stationary energy, which is one of the mandatory sectors, and therefore it falls under basic. Okay, last one to go. And that is an electric train operating within the city. Electric trains operating within the city. This is a scope 2 source because it's electricity, but is it basic or basic plus? Okay, we've got the correct answer is basic, because electric trains comes under transportation, and transportation is a mandatory sector for basic, so it falls under basic. It's a basic emission source. If it was operating outside the city, then it would be basic plus because it's a transboundary source. Because it's operating within the city, it is a source that comes under basic. Okay, great. So that's the end of the mentee quiz for now. We've got one mentee quiz left, but for now, I'm going to go back to my slides.
Hi, Michael. Could you have your PDF in the full screen mode?
Yes, it should be back in the full screen now.
Is this a full screen?
Can you see it? Sorry, Deep, can you see my screen?
This is in full screen mode.
Yes. Is it not showing very?
From the PDF.
Yes. Why is it showing up very small on your screen?
Yeah, if you just increase the text size, that should be fine.
Okay. So then just to recap, so these are the GPC basic minimum requirements. So to be compliant with the GPC and with the Global Compact of Measures, you need to meet the basic requirements. So these are the minimum requirements for a basic inventory. You need to define your inventory boundary. So you need to define your geographic area of your city. And the best way to do that is to include a map of your city boundary in your reporting tool. You need to report a time span, so have a defined 12-month period for your reporting period. So that could be either a year, a calendar year, it could be a financial year. It's up to you to define the time span, but it has to be 12 consecutive months for obvious reasons. And you need to define your city information, your population, and your GDP. So that defines your inventory boundary. And next up are the activities. You need to cover stationary energy, so emissions from buildings and from other facilities, factories, etc. In boundary travel, so all travel taking place inside your city boundary, and waste generated by your city. And so this covers scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. For stationary, it is combustion of primary fuels in your city, scope 1, and the use of electricity, scope 2. It covers in-boundary travel, which is travel within your city boundary, either from the combustion of fuels like diesel or petrol, or from the use of electricity in trains or electric vehicles. And waste, either waste disposed of in your city boundary, in which case it's scope 1 because it's in the city boundary, or if you send your waste beyond your city boundary, it becomes a scope 3 source. You'll need to report emissions for 3 gases: for carbon dioxide, CO2, for methane, CH4, and for nitrous oxide, N2O. And they're often captured in your emission factors. And you'll need the following data. You need activity data, so data on the amount of energy used in your buildings, or the amount of fuel used by your vehicles, or the distance traveled, or the weight of waste generated. You'll need emission factors to convert the activity data into an emission total. You'll need to know your data sources, your assumptions, and your methodologies. And you'll need to conduct a data quality assessment. So this completes an inventory. This completes a robust, a complete, and transparent inventory. And Cirrus, the tool we'll be using, covers all of this. But just to remember, this is your minimum requirements for a GPC basic inventory. So now I have a quick overview of what that looks like. So this is the reporting framework within the GPC. So you've got your subsectors here. You've got your station. This is for stationary energy. Your subsectors. You have scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and I've given them different colors. And the different colors mean different things. The green color means it's a required activity for basic. So this includes all your scope 1 emissions from buildings and all your scope 2 emissions from buildings. Dark blue indicates it's required for basic plus, and these are your scope 3 emissions for buildings. So this could be transmission and distribution losses. It could be the material used or the energy embedded in the materials that you use, but that's for basic plus. The highlighted color here in pink deserves special consideration, and we'll come on to this in the webinar on Monday next week. But in addition to reporting your scope 1 emissions, you should also report any emissions from power generated within the city that is supplied to a regional grid. So if you do have a power station in your city boundary that is connected to the national or regional grid, we don't report those emissions under your basic inventory, but you do capture them and you do report on them to make it a complete inventory. But I'll discuss this more next week because it is quite complicated. But for now, just bear in mind, the green colors are for your basic inventory, the purple colors are for your basic plus inventory, and this is an additional reporting requirement within the GPC. as we see here. I've just annotated them here. So green is basic, purple is basic plus or dark blue, pink is territorial, which is additional reporting, grey is not applicable, those emissions just don't exist, and orange would be other scope 3, which is kind of the May style of reporting. For transportation, we have scope 1 and scope 2 come under basic. So these are all your emissions taking place in your city boundary, either from primary fuel combustion or from the use of electricity, and any transboundary emissions, so any emissions from travel taking place outside your city boundary, are basic plus and come under scope 3. For waste, it's a bit more of a confusing picture, but again, we'll spend time going through this in detail during the session on waste. But you have waste generated in the city is either scope 1 or scope 2, depending on where it's disposed. So scope 1 if it's disposed in your city, scope 3 if it's disposed outside your city. But then if your city accepts any waste from other cities for disposal within your city, it is waste that it's waste that belongs to another city, but the emissions take place inside your city. You report them under as a special category as well, under the pink category, which is territorial. So they don't count towards your basic total, but they are reported for completeness. Same for biological treatments. Any waste generated by your city is reported either as scope 1 or scope 2, or scope 3, sorry. But if your city accepts waste from other cities, you should report on them as well, but they don't count towards your basic total. And same for incineration, and the same for wastewater generated in your city, either scope 1 or scope 2. But if your city accepts wastewater from other cities, it is a separate category. But again, we'll come on to this in detail when we deep dive into waste. So that's basically the structure for reporting emissions from different sectors. The GPC has a very useful table, which is this table. So let me just stop sharing my screen for a second, so you can see what I'm sharing with you. Actually difficult to see with the background I've got on. But essentially, there's a table in the GPC, which is also in your workbook, which brings all of those different sectors together and really defines and tells you very clearly which emission source each sector belongs to and which reporting framework it belongs to, if it's scope 1 or scope 2 or scope 3. So a very useful table to always refer back to. There's a hands up. I'm assuming that's a question.
Yes, it's Nizam. You have a question? Can unmute.
Oh, that's a difficult question. So LUCF was an old term, and we now use a FOLU. So FOLU is the term that's now used for LUCF. So for our purposes, we're just using a FOLU, but by and large, it should be considered as part of the same original sector. Okay, so then I'm going to come on to my final part of the presentation before we complete for today. And I know it's been a long session, so well done for sticking with me till now. This is the Common Reporting Framework. So this is the framework that is being designed by the Global Covenant of Mayors. I was chair of the committee that produced this framework. And the idea really was to build upon the GPC and to create a slightly more inclusive framework for reporting emissions inventory that took into account some other needs and interests as well. So it goes beyond the GPC, but not too much. So essentially they're essentially the same thing, but the CRF requires a few more data sources. So for a bit of background, the Global Covenant of Mayors is a global alliance of cities. Roughly 10,000 cities are part of the Global Covenant of Mayors, covering almost 1 billion people, and around 80 cities in Southeast Asia are already a member of the Global Covenant of Mayors. If you sign up to the Global Covenant of Mayors, you commit to developing a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. You commit to assessing your climate risks and vulnerabilities. You commit to defining ambitious mitigation, resilience, and energy targets. You commit to creating a full climate action plan. And you commit to tracking your progress on mitigation, adaptation, and access to energy. So it is a network of cities that collectively are committing to ambitious, robust climate action. There are two websites which you might want to have a look at. One is globalcovenantofmayors.org, which is the global site, and there's a sort of a subsite for the Asian cities called asian-mayors.eu. The background is it is a merger from something called the Compact of Mayors and the EU Covenant of Mayors, and it's now a joint force called the Global Covenant of Mayors, which is really a global network to really showcase and accelerate city climate action. There are lots of resources on their website, so do have a look. Even if you're not a member, it is very useful to have a look at their resources. So to ensure consistency in reporting between the cities that make up the Global Covenant, they created a common reporting framework, which is a standardized measurement and reporting procedure to ensure consistent and transparent reporting of achievements and progress. And it covers a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, a risk assessment, target setting, and climate action and energy access plan. So it defines what the signatories are expected to report on to continue to be a member of the Global Covenant of Mayors. This is the reporting framework is available on their website, and the link is here, and we'll share this with you after the presentation, so you've got all the notes. That gives you a bit more detail on what to report, why, and how as well. But the inventory one is very much based upon the GPC. So what's the difference between the GPC and the CRF? The GPC is a standard. No one's going to check if you've reported to GPC inventory or not, because it's a standard. There is no membership of the GPC. It is just a standard. The CRF is the membership requirement of GCOM. So it is a reporting framework and a reporting requirement, whereas the GPC is just a standard. No one's enforcing the standard. No one's validating the standard, but the GCOM is enforcing the CRF, which is very much based upon the GPC. But the key difference is one is a standard and one is a reporting framework and a reporting requirement. So what's the difference? So the CRF is fully aligned with the GPC, but there are minor differences, and the differences are as follows. Within the GPC, there is a category called commercial and institutional buildings and facilities. In the CRF, they break them up into two different sectors. So they ask you to break up commercial from institutional. And again, institutional tends to be public buildings, city hall, public offices, street lighting, etc. So they require those to be split into two. There is a sector in the GPC called non-specified sources, which no one really knows why it's in there or what to do with it, and the CRF takes it out. So there's no need to have that additional subsector called non-specified sources. So very minor differences under stationary energy. Under transportation, again, they've adopted the same five sectors, same five subsectors: on-road, rail, waterborne navigation, aviation, and off-road. And what the CRF asks you is to break these down further into fleet type. So are the emissions coming from municipal operations? So for example, city-owned vehicles, police vehicles, garbage trucks, private vehicles, commercial vehicles, or public vehicles like public buses. So they require you to further break down the transportation by fleet type. So for on-road, you would break it down by vehicles owned by private people, vehicles owned by companies, vehicles owned by the transportation network, and vehicles owned by the city authority. So a further breakdown by fleet type, but that's the only difference. And then they've also have a separate section for energy generation. And they're asking cities to report on all the power generated in the city, all the power generated by any facilities owned by the city, even if these are outside the city boundaries. So, for example, if your city should own a power facility, an energy generation plant, but it's outside the city boundary, you should report on that as well. This rarely happens. There are a few examples where cities own power stations outside the city, or they own power stations at all. But where they do, they should report these under the CRF. And cities should also report if they use, so they should disaggregate if they use combined heat and power, which is a way of generating heat, but also generating power at the same time. They should report that separately from electricity generation. So a few differences for energy generation, but by and large, very, very similar. And you can see here again in the diagram on your right. On the left, you've got the subsectors, and then you can see they're very similar to the GPC. And you've also got in the third column, you've got the GPC reference number to show how those CRF categories align with the GPC, but very, very similar. So as part of these webinars, we'll go through both GPC and CRF requirements. So you'll be introduced to both. And in the Cirrus, the reporting tool that we're going to be using, it captures everything in one go. So and it produces both a GPC inventory, but also a CRF inventory. So you produce one inventory, but you get two different outputs, depending upon whether you want to report your GPC or whether you want to report to the CRF. But there aren't many differences. The main differences are just the differences in disaggregation. So the emissions are still the same. It's just more how you present the data that is slightly different. And this is where we compare the two. And again, when you get the slides, do have a look, but it shows you exactly that they're very, very similar, the GPC and the CRF. The only difference really being in those additional categories at the bottom around energy generation and the need to provide some further disaggregation between for some sectors. Okay, so that's everything for today. I'm just going to answer one question that was raised in the chat, which was a question: do we need our greenhouse gas report to be approved by another party? So no, you don't. So for GCOM or for a GPC, you don't. What GCOM will do is they will have a look at your inventory to make sure it is compliant, but it's not your requirement to do that yourself. GCOM will do that through an automated check within CDP. Their reporting platform, they'll do an automated check to make sure it all makes sense and all the boxes are complete. But that will only focus on the boxes to make sure you've completed all the requirements. There's an answer in the box for those requirements, and to test to make sure you've got the right ballpark. But what they won't do is they won't check your methodologies. They won't check it if it's accurate. They won't check you've done your calculations properly, and that is not required. It is very much recommended, but it's up to you really to do that yourself. So you can commission a consultant to do that. You can maybe do that yourself. So someone else in another team does that for you, or you could work with another organization or a peer city. You swap each other's inventories and you both review the other person's or the other city's inventory. But it's not a requirement. It's definitely a key part in terms of making sure your inventory is of high quality. But it's not going to be a mandatory element. What GCOM will simply do is they'll simply do a check to make sure you've completed the relevant cells and your answers seem to be right, and you haven't missed it by a factor of 1,000, for example. But it's very much recommended. And in the penultimate session, and the last two sessions will focus on review and verification and so forth. So hopefully we can revisit those questions then again as well. There's another question. In determining the scopes of the sectors, will there be double counting when we consider a sector that has been counted in another city? So yes. So within the GPC, you might double count emissions inventories if you have two separate GPCs. So what's counted in one city may also be counted in another city, depending upon the methodology you use. So therefore, you can't add GPC inventories together to arrive at a national total, for example. The GPC is consistent and robust for an individual city, but if you add them up, there is a risk of some double counting. This applies to the city-induced framework only. For the territorial approach, there is no double counting because you're only looking at emissions taking place within your city boundaries. So if you do want to add emissions up together from different cities, just focus on the territorial framework. But the GPC, the city-induced framework, there could be some overlap. So you don't want to add those up together, but they are there mainly for comparison. But at a national level, you don't want to add up the city-induced framework, but you can add up the territorial framework, because otherwise, indeed, there is the risk of double counting. So you count emissions that from, say for waste, the example you're giving, if you import emissions, you count them as well in your basic plus framework, but another city includes them in their basic framework. So there is indeed that risk of double counting across cities. But if you want to do that, then just focus on the territorial framework, which avoids double counting because it just focuses on emissions within your city boundary. Okay, so a quick recap of today. I know it's been a whirlwind tour, and this was just to whet your appetite and get you kind of in the frame for the next few sessions. So we covered why compiling an inventory is important and what arguments you might want to use to convince different stakeholders why it's so important. We discovered why measuring emissions at the city level is also very important, as opposed to just at the national level. We looked at the GPC, the background and the purpose of the GPC. We looked at those 5 accounting and reporting principles, and every time you feel conflicted or you're not sure, always go back to those 5 principles, because they will help you to weigh up and help you to make some very important decisions where you're unsure which direction to take. And again, there are no right or wrong answers. There is really what's best for you and for your city, given your circumstance and your access to data and your own priorities. We looked at the inventory boundary. So what's included for a GPC? We talked about, the physical boundary. We talked about the year, the gases, the sectors, and so forth. We then talked about categorizing greenhouse gas emissions. So looking at sectors and looking at scopes. We talked about the reporting requirements, where we looked at the territorial framework and the city-induced framework. We looked at basic and basic plus. And finally, we looked at the common reporting framework and the differences between the common reporting framework and the GPC. Again, the GPC is a standard. The common reporting framework is a requirement for reporting. It's a framework. And we looked at the minor differences between the two, which, as I mentioned, will be fully captured by Cirrus, the tool that we'll be using to compile and report our emissions inventory. So with that, we've come to the end of today. So we've covered the first module, and on Wednesday we'll continue with calculating emissions, which will be the second module. So with that, I'll stop showing my screen, and we've got sort of 5 minutes left for any questions, but I'll hand over to Deep for that.
Thanks, Michael, for the presentation on module 1 today. I'll open up to Q&A. Any more questions? So this will be it. Okay. So this is session 1 out of 8. We have 7 more sessions. Looks like everyone stayed. I think some have to leave for a meeting and all, but I think about 90% stayed until the end. So that's good. So for session 2 onwards, we will share the slides in advance so that you can refer to it during the breakout sessions. You can use it. Awesome. I think there's one question we have not answered. Sorry. LPG pipeline to a factory. scope of emissions. Michael, unmute. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so that's a scope 1 emission because it's primary. It's a combustion of a primary fuel. LPG is a primary fuel. It's a fossil fuel, and because you're combusting it, you're using it. You're combusting it inside the city boundary. Therefore, it is a scope 1 emission source. Scope 2 only applies to electricity, or if you have a bigger network of heat or cooling. But if it refers to a primary fuel, anything you can burn, then it falls under scope 1.
Great. I hope that answers your question, Chihari, if you're still in the meeting room.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I have a question. So I'm here to understand that CRF is actually a reporting requirements, because I need to understand like CRF is like an update of GPC, but that's not the case, right?
Yeah, it's a reporting requirement, and again, it's based upon the GPC. The GPC is a standard, but the GCOM wanted, because of different partner interests, they wanted some flexibility, and so you have that flexibility in the breakdown of some of these subsectors. But it is a requirement to be a member of GCOM. When you as GCOM you sign up as a member, but then you have a couple of years to meet those requirements. And if you don't meet those requirements, then you no longer become a member. So it's the idea is that to be part of that group, you have to meet a minimum standard to call yourself a member, and therefore to claim to be a leader on climate change. So they will check those requirements. But as I mentioned, they won't go into full detail. They just make sure that you've submitted an inventory and it looks fine. It looks broadly okay. But they won't check your methodology. They won't check your calculations. They'll just check to make sure that you've completed the necessary cells and the boxes in Cirrus or another reporting tool.
Yeah, I think there were issues with the breakout rooms today. Not to worry. Today is just the introduction. I think the breakout rooms will be more meaningful when we are deep into the calculations, using the workbook and all that. So yeah, there'll be a longer time.